Và hello, xin chào tất cả mọi người và lại là mình đây. Chào mừng mọi người đến với 727 Learning Studio. Thì hôm nay chính là thử thách ngày thứ 11 học code. Thực ra thì cái thử thách 11 ngày thì tôi muốn giữ cho mình một cái gọi là cái thói quen tốt, nên là mỗi ngày đều phải học thôi. Thì thực ra tôi thấy là một ngày nên học từ 3 tới 4 tiếng nó sẽ hiệu quả hơn. Nhưng mà hôm nay ăn chay mà kiểu nó mệt mệt trong người á, nên on trễ mà học chúng chắc có 1 tiếng thôi. Chứ như ngày mà thứ bảy chủ nhật là học tới 4 5 tiếng một lần. Ý, 6 7 tiếng luôn ấy chứ. Nó nhanh hơn, nó mau qua hết bài học hơn. Ok, mọi người cùng học nha. Đúng bài chưa? Đúng rồi này. Rồi từ đầu khúc này nói nhanh quá không nhớ gì.
Functionality in our game, which is the high scores. And to really understand how the high score should work in this game, let's take a look at the demo again. So let's reload the game, and let's start here. And so you see that the score starts at 19. So let's try a couple of times, do a low score. Okay, so correct number, the score is 10, and the high score is now also set to 10, because this was my first game, and so now this is also my new high score. But now as I play again, my score is of course reset to 20, but now if I do a better score than this 10 here, then that will become my new high score. Okay, and that is going to happen as soon as I win the game. So let's play again. And wish for a quick result. And great. So now my score is 17. And since that is more than the 10 that I had before, that is now also my high score.
Skip qua ta, tại cái này mình bài này mình biết rồi.
Check. We already...
Nhưng mà hồi sáng mình chơi á, mình có nhờ mấy thằng cái công ty nó có check giùm mình là nó có một cái bug nha mọi người. Một cái bug đó là khi mà bạn không để nhưng đáng tiếp được. Mà mình thấy copy với cái mã của thầy cũng y chang, nó khác éo gì đâu. Giờ mình biết cái bug đó mà để biết sửa sao.
Yes. And in this scenario where the guest... To finish this project, let's now learn about a technique called refactoring in order to get rid of some of our duplicate code. So, as I said by the end of the last lecture, we have some repeated code in our project. And more specifically, where we can really see this is in these two scenarios, where the guess is too high and where the guess is too low. So here, this code is really almost the same as this code down here. The only thing that really changes is this string here. So this message that we display if the guess is too high or if it's too low. And so having a lot of duplicate code.
Ôi, thầy yếu rồi, cái khúc này em làm khác thầy nha, hơi bị gọn nha.
So the dry principle. So right now, all of this code here is not dry. Now, why is it actually so bad to have duplicate code, you might ask? Well, one of the answers is that whenever we have duplicate code, when we then want to change some functionality, we have to change the same code in multiple places. For example, we might want to change the message when the player loses the game. Guess is right number. So now we two conditions that we had earlier, where the guess was either greater or larger than the secret number. Both of these basically mean that the guess is different than the secret number. And so we just created a block for that, because all of this code here is the same in both situations. The only thing that changes is the message that is displayed on the page. And so here, we then basically determined that message with the ternary operator. So here is where we then asked if the guess is greater than the secret number. And if it is, then the text content here should be too high. But if it's not, then the text content should become too low. And remember that this works, and that's too high. 1, 2, 3, 4 times. Down here, yeah, here, so 5 times even. So that's a lot of duplicate code. And the same is true for setting the number, or for setting the score, or also, for example, for calculating this random secret number. We have the same code here, and also here. And whenever that happens, we can also refactor this same code into a function, and then call the function in all the places where we have to duplicate code. So basically, we can refactor functionality that we use over and over again into their own functions in order to make the code more dry. Now, I'm not going to do that into all the examples that I just mentioned, but I will do it with setting the message text content. All right. So what I will do is to copy this, okay, and then I will create a function out here. And the function will be called display message. So it's a function, and the parameter will be the message. And then in the function block, all we will do is this repeated code, so setting the message, and then we will set it equal to the message that is passed into the function. All right. And now to show you how it works, well, let's just use it down here. So instead of this, let me comment it out. I can now simply say display message, and then with this string. So this string is now the argument. Okay. And so this argument is what will become the message here in this function when I call it, right?
Okay.
And so then here we
text content, vậy mình phải add cái function này đúng không? Làm gọn cái test lại. Function. Ủa, display message. Mình đã có chỗ nào mà ta? Ủa, cái khúc này. Ê, mình làm đúng nha.
say that,
Vẫn đúng
and just
nha,
to show
cái
you
này
that it
em vẫn làm
works,
đúng nha thầy.
occurrences of this, what all of this. And now we can, you lost the game. Okay, and down here there's another one. Yes, here. So display message, but our code is with this we finished this project.
Làm right cái project lại.
Welcome back. Let's now start working on project number 2 of this section.
Model Windows.
And in this small project, we're going to build our first UI component. And that is this modal window that we can see here by opening, or by clicking actually, on one of these buttons.
Em cũng
So
muốn
I'm
học
sure
cái này
you've
thầy
seen
ơi,
this
em
kind
cũng
of
học cái này.
component all over the place when visiting web pages. And so it's simply this window here, basically, and this overlay, which gets overlaid over the rest of the page, right? So no matter which of these 3 buttons we click, it will always open this modal window. And to close this window, as you already saw, we can either click this button here, or we can click outside of the window. So basically on this overlay. And again, I'm sure that you have seen this functionality when visiting other web pages. So that worked as well. And finally, we can also close this window by hitting the escape key on our keyboard, like this.
Em cũng không biết lúc đó escape
Okay.
enter gì.
And this is actually very simple and very easy to build.
Okay.
Probably way easier than it looks like. But it will still be very useful to learn how to work with classes. And that's super important because manipulating classes is actually the main way in which we manipulate web pages. Okay. Now here on the left side, I still have the code from the previous project open. And that's because I wanted to show you how to close the live server. So let's go back to the terminal. And so as we hit new terminal, it actually creates a new terminal. So if we want to go to the first one that was already running, we need to go here to this menu here, and then number 1, which is this note. So to change this now, we hit Control C, and that's even Control on a Mac. So it's not Command C, it is Control C. And I guess on Windows, it's going to be the same. But if it's not, you can just click this trash can here, and that will also then kill the terminal. So as I hit Control C, the process has finished, and so the live server is no longer running. So if I come here to this URL, so this localhost URL plus the current port, which is 8080, so if I now reload this page, it will be gone. So there's no connection possible anymore because I just killed the live server. Okay, just wanted to let you know about that. Okay, anyway, let's now close up this folder here and open a new one. And as always, I already have here the starter files for this modal project. So let's open up a new VS Code window.
Model.
And let's open up this one. And once again, I have the prettier configuration here. And then the index, the JavaScript, and the CSS styles. Okay, open up script. And actually, we can open all of them because we will want to take a look at the 3 files. Okay, and as before, we still are using strict mode, and so I already included that here at the top of the file. Okay, and now let's get to work actually. Now this time we will actually start by selecting everything that we're going to need for this project. So that's usually what we do when we build a project like this. So we select the elements that we need, and then we store the selections into variables. Okay, and then we can use them over and over again. So that's way better than selecting the same elements over and over again, like we did in the last project. All right, but in the last project, I didn't want to overcomplicate stuff and do too many things at the same time, and so I just selected all the stuff multiple times. But again, this time, we will have all the necessary selections, so all the necessary elements that we're going to need, nicely organized here at the top of the file, each in its own variable. So let's take a look at the HTML. And so here we see the 3 buttons. So that's these 3 buttons.
Khoan, em chưa có load vô thầy ơi. Chờ em load vô cái thầy ơi. Rồi.
And then we actually already have the modal window here in the code. So this div element here. So it's already in the code, it's simply hidden. That's why it has this hidden class.
Hidden.
And now in the CSS, let's come here to the bottom of the file. And so the hidden class simply sets the display to none. And so that's why the window is currently hidden. All right. So again, as I said in the beginning, in this project, we will work with classes. And so this hidden class is the main class that we will be concerned with. So anyway, this means that we will not basically create the HTML for the modal window using JavaScript. It is already there. All we will do is to show it and to hide it according to the clicks on the buttons. So that's the modal, and that is the overlay. So that's basically this dark part here, which hides the background. And then here we have this button to close the modal window. And so that's all that we need. So again, we need to select the modal, the overlay, the close modal button, and then of course the show modal buttons. Okay, so let's do that. So const modal is document.querySelector, and then just like before, we are looking for the element with the class of modal. Okay, so just like we did in the first project, we select an element using the selector, but then this time we actually store the result of the selection, so the selected element, in this variable. Okay, so that's the element with the class modal. Now we want overlay and then close modal. So overlay, and of course we could give these any names that we wanted, but these names make it easy to understand what they are. So I'm giving them the same names as the class names, basically. So that's the overlay. And now the close modal button.
Cái style này nhìn khó chịu quá ta. Style này nhìn khó chịu à. Ít nhất phải nhìn như vậy chứ hai cái nó màu trắng trắng nó nhìn khó chịu vãi chưởng ra. Dark modern nữa. Cái bi là gì? Cái bi này cũng được nè. Nó hơi bị trùng màu. Đâu má trắng quá. Áo em trắng quá nhìn không ra. Give me dark. Không, nó chưa có cái sự phân biệt giữa các lệnh. Kimochi. Ủa mà giả sử cái kia phải mua hả? Để mình dọc cái kia thử nha. Mono Kai Pro. Rồi mua sao? Mắc quá. No no, mắc quá, em không mua này đâu thầy ơi, thầy đừng có lừa em không có tiền. Em thấy cái đáp model này cũng khó nhìn, cái này khó nhìn quá. Nó phải tìm cách để mà kiếm được cái đâm mà thiệt là đẹp, mà thiệt là dễ nhìn. Đó là ngày hôm nay của chúng ta. Có nhìn khó chịu vậy? Ở này mù luôn, chung hết màu xanh luôn kìa. Khó nhìn quá. Họ ba cái chung một màu luôn. Có sự phân biệt của hai cái kia. Này đi, cái này mẹ đi. Quá.
Let's call this one actually a button. So btn, which stands for button, and then close modal document dot query selector, and then this class is close dash modal. Okay, and now finally we also want the show modal buttons. Now there are actually 3 elements with this class name. So let me show you what happens when we simply select in the same way that we did before. So let's say button, or buttons actually, because we want multiple, open modal, and then document dot query selector dot open modal. Okay, and so watch what happens when we log this to the console. So buttons, open modal, that's the one. And now to actually see this, we need to again start the live server. So new terminal, clear this console, and then all I have to do is to type live server, hit enter, and here we go. So this is our modal window now, and this one we can now close. And actually it has the exact same URL. So it's always this 127.0.0.1, which stands for localhost at port 88. So if we reloaded this one, it would show us the same thing. Okay, so we can just close one of them, and so it looks exactly the same as the demo, but of course nothing's going to happen yet, because as you know, we have no event handlers on any of these buttons yet. But now I wanted to take a look at the console, and yeah, and now here we get null for some reason.
Em không có chữ no. Open à? Thấy chữ no à?
So it means that it could not select anything here for this selector. And so let's take a look. Yeah, actually it is show modal and not open. Okay, so let's fix that. So it's not open, it is show. And maybe you have spotted that if you took a more careful look at the HTML than I did. Now anyway, now we see this careful look at it is HTML than I did.
Số nữa. Số hả? Địch cũ á, thầy rảnh quá, thầy tự gài rồi thầy tự bắt tụi em sửa lỗi, thầy rảnh thiệt á.
Now anyway, now we see this button here selected. However, as you can see, it is only the first one, okay? And so now we see the limitation of our query selector method here for the first time. So whenever we use query selector with a selector which actually matches multiple elements, only the first one will get selected. And so here we need another one, but it's pretty similar. It's called query selector all. So that's a pretty obvious name, but it's going to do the job. So as I save now you see that we get something called a node list here. So let me open that. And now as I hover, you see that these are actually all of our 3 buttons. Okay. So this node list here is a little bit like an array. It's not exactly like an array, but here for now, it works as though it was an array. Okay. And so now if we want to do something, for example, to all of these buttons, then we can simply loop through this node list and do something with them. So let's actually quickly do that. So we will now again use the for loop. And now I hope there's no need to explain anymore how this one works. So I should stay below the length of this node list, which again, for our purposes here, works just like an array. Buttons, open modal dot length, and then at the end of each iteration, increase the counter. And so in each iteration, what we want to do is simply to log to the console the text content of each of them. All right. So what we want to do is buttons, open modal, and then we take the current one. And so this here is now an element. Okay, it's one of these elements. And well, now it already logged because it saved the file. But yeah, anyway, each of these here is one element. And so now on each of them, we can simply use the text content property just like we did in the last project. All right, so let's save it again. And indeed, now we get the 3 text contents for all the 3 buttons. And here you might have noticed that I didn't even use the curly braces to define a block. And that's because just like in an if-else statement, if there's only one line of code that I want to execute.
Hả? Rồi ta.
Mấy lúc này em nhớ mà cái mặt bé mặt cốt tinh nè.
Và cái phần kia nó bị loop rồi, loop rất là lâu rồi, không ai đăng anh lên mạng search cũng không có luôn nha.
Ủa không? Trời em nhớ anh có full bộ mà anh không xóa đâu rồi.
Không có xóa, em giữ. Thì giữ đăng cỡ tập 1 tới tập 6 được tiếng rồi.
I actually don't have to create. There's only one line of code that I want to execute. I actually don't have to create this block. Okay, I can just write one line after the for loop, and then that's the one that will be iterated over and over again. Okay, so again, this works just fine. And now I have a way of selecting multiple elements with the same class. And then with the for loop, I can do something for each of them. In this case, all we did was to log their text content to the console. But in the future, we will then be able to do real stuff using this technique. Okay, and that's it for this video. In the next one, we will actually already make this modal window work. So don't wait, and let's move on to the next video right away. Let's now actually learn how to manipulate classes with JavaScript. But the first thing that we have to do is to actually react to a click on each of these buttons here. So right now, of course, nothing happens. And so now we need to attach an event handler to each of these 3 buttons. Now we finished the last video by learning how we can do something for all of these 3 buttons at the same time, right? So for that, we used a for loop, which loops over this node list, which is basically an array holding all of the buttons. And so this buttons open modal at position number I is the current button element in each iteration. And then from there, we simply read the text content property just like on any other element. All right. But now let's take it one step further. And instead of simply reading the text content property, we will call the addEventListener method, just like we learned in the last project. Okay. So remember, in order to respond to a click event, we will attach an event handler function to the element. And event handler and event listener are pretty much the same thing. So that's why this method is called event listener. So let's say add event listener, and then the name of the event. And that is once more the click event. And then the second argument is the function which will contain the code that should be executed once the button is clicked. So that will be an anonymous function, remember, so a function without a name. And it is, of course, also a function expression, because it's simply this value here. So this function value. So just as I explained multiple times already, but it's important to keep remembering this stuff as we go here through this section. And to start, let's simply log to the console the text content of the button that was clicked. Now here there's actually a mistake, because of course we don't want to log to the console this event listener, right? That doesn't make any sense. Instead, we now want to log something to the console right here inside this handler function. So that's just CL again. And then let's just say button clicked. Give it a save. And now each of these 3 buttons here has their own event handler function attached to it. So button clicked. And when we click on this one,
Xí nha thầy. Bên em đéo ra. Button. Có ra.
then the same should appear. And indeed, now we have 2. So that's what this 2 means.
Phải
As we
bấm
click
ra.
here, we get another one and another and another. And so, yeah, this worked. So we attached this function here now to all of the 3 buttons. And again, because we did it here in the loop while we were looping over this node list, which contains all of these 3 buttons. Okay, but now, of course, this is not the only thing that we want to do. Instead, we want to display the modal. And remember that this modal is already in the HTML. It is hidden right now because it has the hidden class. If it did not have this hidden class, it would be visible. Let me actually show that. So I delete it, and if I save it now, then you see here is the modal. Right? Here it is. And that's because the hidden class is now gone. And so basically this is exactly what we will do using JavaScript. So removing this class. Okay? So what we want to do is to take the modal. So this element that we selected here previously, right? So we selected it and then stored it into this variable. And so now we take that selected element, and on there we can read the class list property. So that's class list. And then this class list property itself has a couple of methods. And the one we're going to use now is remove. And as I just explained, the class that we're going to remove is the class called hidden. Okay? And we can actually also remove multiple classes. For that, we just have to pass them in with commas like this. So here we then can specify more classes. Just keep in mind that we do not use the dot here. So not like this. Okay? And I'm telling you that because I used to do that mistake myself, and I remember that. So yeah, I want you to avoid it. Okay, so the dot is only for the selector. But here, we are not anymore selecting anything. We're just passing in the name of the class. And so all we need is a string with that name. Okay? Now, besides removing classes, we can also add classes, and we can even check if an element contains a certain class or not. And we will use all of them in this video and the next one. Okay? And this should actually already do the trick. So when I save this now, and let's click here, and it worked. Great. So the hidden class is now gone, and I can show that to you here using the inspect. And then we need to give it some more space back. And then you see here the modal class that used to be here is no longer there. Now we can of course not close it because that functionality is not yet there, but at least now it is open. Now we also have the overlay, which is this one, which also has the hidden class. And so in order to show that overlay, we need to remove the hidden class from this element as well. So that's easy enough. It's just the same thing again. So overlay dot class list dot remove, and then again hidden. All right. And yeah, beautiful. That's really nice. So using classes like this is a really great and handy way of manipulating web pages. And in practice, adding and removing classes like we just did here is the main way in which we change styles on websites. That's because a class basically aggregates many styles in just one class. Now in this case, actually the hidden class only contains this one style here. So this would have been the same as specifying the display style directly in JavaScript. So like we learned in the last project. So we could have done also modal.style.display and then set it to block, I guess, or what was it? Yeah, nothing. So basically, display none means that it's not visible. And if we want it to be visible, we would set it to display block. Okay, so this would do the exact same thing, but you can see that it's a bit more of a pain because then we would have to memorize what exactly we have to write here. So the exact property name and the exact value. And this is only for one style. Imagine that the hidden class actually had 10 properties. Then we would have to write all of these properties here manually and change all their values. So that's a lot of work and it's not fun. And so instead, we can basically aggregate all of these properties in one class that we then define here in CSS. And then in JavaScript, we simply add and remove these classes as we need or don't need these styles. So usually when you need to manipulate styles on a page, then always just export the styles into a class and then use the class just like we did here. All right. Now what we just did here is for showing the modal window, but now let's also add the ability of then hiding it by clicking that button. So this button here. Okay. So right now, as I said, it's not possible to close the window unless we reload the whole page. So let's take this button here that we already selected and simply add an event listener to that one as well. So button close modal dot add event listener And again, waiting for the click event. And then let's specify our function here again. Okay, so again, we are just defining the function here. We are not calling it itself. It is the JavaScript engine who will call this function as soon as the click event happens on exactly this element. All right. Anyway, here we now want to do the opposite. So basically, we want to add the class back on. So modal.classList.add this time. And so we add the hidden class back on, which will then hide the modal. And the same actually for the overlay. So let's just duplicate this line here and change this to overlay. And yeah, this should already work. So that already worked before. And now let's check it. And yes, it does. And it should work for all the 3 buttons, of course. And yeah, it does. Great. So again, this is a very common thing to do. We change the appearance of websites and of elements like this all the time using this class technique. Next up, usually when we click outside of a modal, then the modal window also closes. So that's pretty common, right? So what I mean is clicking this area here outside should also close this window. So basically, we want this code here to also be executed when we click on the modal, or actually on the overlay. So let's do that. So overlay.add event listener click. And now what should I do? Well, just to make it work, I can copy this code here, but you already know that this is not a good idea, probably. But let's just, for now, see if it works. So if we click outside, so this is the overlay. So as we click it now, then indeed, the modal and the overlay are both hidden again. Great. So this works now. But again, we do not want this same code here in these 2 places. We want actually the exact same function to be executed, no matter if we click the close button or if we click the overlay. So how should we do that? Well, we can simply export this function into a more real named function. So let me cut the code from here, and then I will create a function called close modal. So const close modal equals this function value. Okay, and so now this variable here is what holds the function value. And so what I can do now is to here specify that close modal function. And that's it. That's the function right here. So this here, what we have here, is exactly the same as this. And again, notice that we are not calling the function. We are not doing this, right? This would not work at all because it would immediately call the function as soon as JavaScript executes this line. But that's not what we want to happen. We want the close modal function to be executed only as soon as the click event happens on the close modal button. All right. And now here we can just do the same thing. So again, close modal. And that's it. That's so much better than what we had before. Not only did we make our code more dry, but we also made it more readable, more expressive, and more declarative. So right now, when we read this code here, it's a lot easier to understand. So we just read button close modal at the event listener of close the modal. Okay, that makes sense. So just by looking at this line, we see that when this element is clicked, then we want to close the modal. The same, when the overlay is clicked, we want to close the modal. All right, and so we know exactly what's going to happen when we read this code. And so for that advantage alone, let's do the same thing here with this function. So the one that opens the modal. So let me grab this one, just put them up here. I can also get rid of this console.log. And so let's put the 2 functions here together. So open modal. And now this function will be just this, right? So I'll just cut it again and paste it here. And so now we assigned this function here to this open modal variable. So once more, a nice function expression. And now we just take that and put it here, open modal. And of course, again, we don't call it. We simply declare, or we define it here and tell JavaScript, hey, whenever a click happens on one of these buttons, then please call this function that we just specify here. All right. And so this is our code, and it's a lot better. And so actually, we just did some refactoring here, and so restructuring our code without changing the functionality. And so that means that our code should still work the same. And indeed, it does. We can open and close in 2 ways, and we can open it on all of the 3 buttons. Beautiful. That's really, really great. So to recap, if you want to use the same function in multiple event listeners, then you need to specify that function as a separate function, like this one here, and then you can pass that function as an argument to multiple add-event-listener methods. So just like we did it here, right? So that's one of the takeaways of this video. And the other one is that we really, in practice, use the functionality of adding and removing classes all the time in order to change the appearance of elements on our page. And that's because classes allow us to basically aggregate multiple CSS properties in just one, like a container. So each class functions a bit like a container with a lot of properties in it. And then here, by adding and removing them, we basically can activate and deactivate certain styles all at the same time. Okay, so keep that in mind, and even better, actually.
Sao nói chuyện mà kiểu mình nhắn lên nhớ gửi hoài gì đâu, cho tiếng tiếng để biết mà trả lời chứ. Đang học chăm chỉ quá không để ý, xin lỗi bạn.
Actually write notes maybe with what I'm saying, because this is really important stuff. So working with classes is something that we do all the time. And there is a third thing that we do with classes, which is to check if a class is actually present on a certain element. And so that's going to be the topic of the next video, along with learning how to actually deal with a key press event. So that's yet another really exciting video. So let's now check that out.
Dám khều gì đâu. Ngày mai hả? Ngày mai không biết reaction gì đâu, bảo à. Chưa biết được. Không biết cái clip của thằng Tiên nó có dài hay không.
Let's now learn how to handle key press events. So right now we can already close the modal by clicking the.
Trời ơi, học cái gì nữa, mình đã học thử thách, mình biết chơi gì nữa, mình đã học thử thách học 100 ngày viết code rồi mà đã không chần dần trên màn hình nữa không? Hôm nay là ngày thứ 11 rồi đó bạn.
The close button and by clicking outside of the modal. But usually there is also a third way, and that's by hitting the escape key on the keyboard, right?
Này chắc cũng phải
so this
listener.
is actually a great use case to learn how to respond to keyboard events. So
Any
in
key.
order to listen for keyboard events, we still need to use add event listener,
Chưa,
because the key press
listener
event
không?
is simply just another type of event. Now, keyboard events are so-called global events because they do not happen on one specific element. And for global events like keyboard events, we
Kiên trì nói, hãy tin ở mình, hãy tin ở mình.
usually listen.
Mình đi được 1/6, 1/5 đoạn đường rồi. Ủa phải không? Đúng mà 1/6 đoạn đường rồi đó.
On the whole document. So let's close this terminal here. And now let's write document. So that's the same document that we use for query selector. And so basically it's a big object which contains a bunch of methods for all kinds of stuff. And that includes the add event listener method. So by using add event listener here on the document, we are basically listening for events everywhere. So no matter where they happen on the page, they will always trigger the event handler that we're going to specify here. All right. Now here about the name of the event itself, there are actually three types of events for the keyboard. There is the key down, the key press, or the key up. Key up, which is, so it's this one. This one only happens when we lift our finger off the keyboard, basically, or off the key. Key press is fired continuously as we keep our finger on a certain key, and key down is fired as soon as we just press down the key. And so usually that is the one that we use. Okay, so the name of this event is just
là sao quá, tiếng Anh khúc này không hiểu.
Continuously.
Cái này chắc dịch là tiếng Việt không hiểu.
As we keep our finger, it's this one. This one only has the key up. Key up, which is, so it's this one. This one only happens when we lift our finger off the keyboard, basically, or off the key.
Là nhấc ra, là nhấc ngón tay ra.
Key press is fired continuously as we keep our finger on a certain key, and key down is fired.
À, hiểu rồi. Cái này phải nói lại thôi. Cái này thầy nói rối quá. Code note nè. Code note cũng lắc. Tức là key up, tức là nhấc ngón tay ra. Đúng là phải là key down chứ, key down có nghĩa là vừa nhấn xuống là thực thi rồi. Còn key press là một key press với key down khác gì nhau ta? Key press là phải nhấn hả? Còn key up là nhấc ngón tay ra. Ok. Đây là bài 81 này. Key down là vừa nhấn xuống. Key press là đè. Còn key up là nhấc ra. Okay.
As soon as we just press down the key. And so usually that is the one that we use. Okay, so the name of this event is just key down, and this event will happen as soon as we hit any key on the keyboard. Okay, and then just like before, we specify a function here. And this time let's specify it here directly, so without creating a separate function. So function, and then the usual way, just like we have been doing. Now, as I just mentioned here, so this function here will actually be executed for any key press that happens. So let me prove that to you. And actually, it will be hard to prove because you cannot see what key I'm pressing. But anyway, a key was pressed. And so now, as I go to the console and just press any key, you see a key was pressed. And it doesn't matter which one. So Q, 3, P, enter, ESC, any key just renders here the same message. However, we only want to close the pop-up when the escape key was pressed. Okay, so that key in the top left corner which says ESC, right? So how will we know which key was actually pressed if this event here happens?
Đúng rồi, má, tiếng Anh nhưng mà không học tiếng Anh á, con học có mà học tiếng Việt không có vô. Nó dịch cái tiếng Việt nó ngộ lắm. Giống như mà học Excel mà học tiếng Việt á, kiểu học Excel mà học tiếng Việt cái gì mà mở file, sau đó gán lệnh nếu thì vải xịt thì chứ trong kia ta if else này nọ, cái kiểu như vô học Excel học tiếng Việt á, nếu thì đi thi mà không Excel mà không có ngồi tiếng Việt là thua luôn. Cái code này cũng vậy nữa, dịch cái tiếng Việt nó tào lao lắm. Tự nhiên length thì dịch cái tiếng độ dài, what the hell, cái gán mã với độ dài đó, rồi gán lệnh cố định hay là gán lệnh linh hoạt, mẹ nó là ăn hạch luôn á, nên phải chịu khó chịu cực.
For all the keys, well, the information about which key was pressed will be stored
Sẵn
in
học
the
tiếng Anh luôn.
event that is going to occur as soon as any key is pressed. So remember, as I hit any key here on the keyboard, a key down event is generated, and our listener function here, so our handler function, is waiting for that event to happen. And anytime that an event like this occurs, JavaScript does in fact generate an object. And that object contains all the information about the event itself, and we can then actually access that object in the event handler function. All right? So again, when an event happened, we can have access to information about that event in the event handler function, just like this one. Now, up until this point, we have never looked at that event. We only just listened for it and then reacted to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But this time, we actually need to look at the event object in order to figure out which key was pressed. And how can we do that? Well, what we need to do is to give this function here a parameter, and let's call it E, which stands for event. So we could also call it event, or we could call it X, or Q, I, so it doesn't matter. But I like to call it E, which stands again for event. Okay? So then, as the event occurs, JavaScript will call this function with the event object as an argument. And once more, this works because we do not call this function here ourselves.
Đa tạ, cảm
Right?
ơn.
We do not call the function,
sẽ
we
cố gắng.
only define it here. So we say,
Tới 100
hey
ngày, cố gắng tới
JavaScript,
100
call this
ngày.
function when a key down event happens. And when you do so, please pass in the event object as an argument. Okay? And we will learn about the mechanics of this a bit better later. But it's probably still a good idea to already take notes of this stuff that I'm explaining. Anyway, now that you know why this function has access to an event, so to this E here, let's now actually take a look at it. So simply logging it to the console for now, and we can actually get rid of this one here. And now I will hit the enter key. And so you see now we get this event, and it's called a keyboard event. It is just an object that is generated by JavaScript. So you see that here in the console, it actually looks like the objects that we generated ourselves previously. So with a key here, and then set by JavaScript. So you see that here in the console, it actually looks like the objects that we generated ourselves previously. So with a key here, and then a value. So a property and a value. And what matters here is basically the key, which, as I said, was enter. So I hit the enter key, and then this event was generated with the key property set to enter. So that's great information, because now when I hit the escape key, then you see that the key was now escape. Or I can, of course, hit any key. So this was the space key. So you see here, we have a space, or the Q, or Z or Control or Shift. And so whatever key you press, we now get this information about the event itself. And in this case, since it was a keyboard event, we get information about which key was pressed. So as you see, the information about the key, I was always getting it from this key property. So let's just log e.key, because remember we used dot and then the property name to read any property from an object. And so escape is now the key that I pressed, or enter, or shift, and so on and so forth. Great. And now that I know which key was actually pressed, I can use that information to actually close the modal whenever the escape key is pressed. So we can simply do if e.key triple equal escape. And then again, let's just log to the console to see if it works. Esc was pressed. And so now I can hit any key and nothing happens. Or actually, some stuff happens because we're still logging here the e.key, but the string that I just wrote here does not appear unless I hit the escape key. So now you see esc was pressed. All right. So that's of course not what we want, but instead we want to close the modal. However, I only want to close the modal when the modal is actually visible, right? And how do we know if the modal is currently visible? Well, if the modal contains the class hidden, it means that it's not visible. And so basically, when it does not contain the class hidden, it means that it's visible, and then that's the condition in which we want to close it. All right? And so we talked in the last lecture about adding and removing classes, but as I mentioned back then, we can also check if an element already has a certain class. And so now that becomes really handy, because now I can do this. So if the escape key is pressed, then we can now check if the modal contains the hidden class. So another if. So if modal, and again dot class list, and then dot contains, and then again the class name. So that's hidden in this case. So if the modal dot class name contains the hidden class, it means that the modal is currently hidden. And so in this condition, we actually don't want to do anything. We only want to close the modal if it does not contain the hidden class, right? And so here we can once more invert that Boolean value.
Em hiểu không
All
này,
right.
em hiểu
So
không
this
này.
not here is very important, as you probably start to see. So let's read this again. If the modal does not contain the hidden class, then close the modal.
Contains.
And so how do we close the modal? Well, we can simply call this close modal function, right? So let's do that. Close modal. And here we do actually need to call this function, okay? Because when this function here is executing, so this one here, as it then reaches this line, of course, something needs to happen. And what needs to happen is basically this code. So we could just copy this code down here, but that's of course not what we want.
No, mình đã có
Instead,
function rồi,
we
không
can
cần.
simply use this function here again, and using means here to call it. So to execute the code that is in here, so this. So let's test this now, and then we can improve the code even a little bit.
Nếu được nha.
So we open it. Now I'm going to press just any key, let's say enter. So you see enter. And now as I hit the escape key, watch what happens.
Ah.
Yes, indeed, the modal is gone. Great. Let's see where this button clicked here comes from in line 9. Now that's of course because of this console.log. And let's get rid of this. Okay, let's try again. Open it on this button. I hit any other key, nothing happens. I hit escape, and it's gone. Great. Now let's read this code here a little bit. So basically this means if the pressed key is escape, and if the modal does not contain the hidden class, then execute this function to close the modal. Now notice how I just said if this and then if this. And so what I mean is that we can actually aggregate these two if statements together. And so this is the same as having just, and I'm cutting it here, so it's the same as having just this. Now we can get rid of this stuff here. And
Tiểu tam yêu nghiệt. Ok, Oh.
And that's it. And so now it reads the exact same way as before. If the pressed key is escape, and if the model does not contain the class of hidden, then close the model. So give it another try, just to make sure. And yes, that works perfect. Beautiful. And with this, our model is actually feature complete. It works exactly as our demo here. And so with this, we finished this very small second project. So once again, I hope you like this one, and I hope you can start to see the power of DOM manipulation so that in the future you will be able to build anything you can imagine just with JavaScript. Now that is of course still a long way to go, but that's also why we have the next project, which is going to be a really nice project to basically train and reinforce most of the things that we already did in this project and the previous one. So the next project is going to be more like a practice project, but I still believe it's very important to do that project in case you have the time. And believe me, it's by far the most exciting thing we have done yet in this course. So I hope to see you there soon after you take a
Doing code
well-deserved
mod
break.
exciting. It's more exciting. What? Big game. Ủa lại game nữa hả? Game con heo.
Welcome back to project number 3 of this section. And this project is going to be the most exciting one, because
Okay.
now we will take everything that we learned in the first 2 projects to a whole new level and build a really cool and amazing game. And this is the game that I was talking about, and it's called the Pig game. Now, this project here is really going to be a practice project. So a project where you and me will together reinforce all the skills that you have learned up until this point. Because remember from the last section, reinforcing knowledge is one of the most important things that you can do to learn, right?
Okay.
So in this project, I will do a little bit less explaining than before, at least about the stuff that we already learned, because we are really just practicing here, okay? Now, if you're in a hurry and just want to learn the basics, please feel free to skip this project. But of course, I would still really advise you to code along with me here. But now let's see how this game actually works. And in fact, you can try that along with me, because this time I hosted this demo on a live website. So you can access that by piggamev2.netlify.app. And the link is also in the README file of the repository for this course on github.com. But anyway, this is more of a real game now, because we actually have 2 players. So you can play this with a friend or something, or just against yourself. So the idea is that we roll a dice. And so now I'm player number 1. So this one is now the active player. So I roll a dice. And so you see that I rolled a 2. And so this number gets added to my current score down here. Okay, so this is my current score for the current round. And this here is my total score. And so let's see how that's going to work. So I can roll the dice again now if I want to. And now I rolled a 4. And that 4 got added to the 2 that I had previously. So now that's 6. And now I can choose to hold this score. So if I click this button, this score of the current round will get added to my total score, which right now is 0. And so when I hold, then my score will be 0 now, and we switched to player number 2. And now I can click roll dice again. So we rolled a 2, and I can hold again. And so now player 2 has 2 points. Now the thing here is that whenever we roll a 1, we lose all our current score, and it's then the next player's turn. And so that's why sometimes we need to hold our points.
Well,
So let me show that to you. And, oh, indeed, I rolled a 1 right away, and so now it's player 2 again. So let's keep rolling the dice, and I will now again wait for a 1, so that you can see that all my current score will be lost. So that's a lot of points already there. And now I rolled a 1, and the player lost all the points. Okay, so I could have held the points, and then I would have added all these points here to my score. So let's do that here. And again, a 1. And so, yeah, now here I hold, and I added them to these points. And I think by now you get how the game works.
okay, okay.
Right?
Tức là
So the
không
first
lát
player
là
to
xong rồi.
reach 100 points then wins the game. But I will now not demonstrate that, because that's going to take too long. We have these 2
Lol.
buttons here, and then we also have, just like in the previous game,
Game này
a way
khó
of
vậy?
resetting the game. So when I click here, as you might expect, this dice will disappear, and all the scores are set back to 0. And to understand this game a little bit better, for this application, I designed something called a flowchart. So let's take a look at that. And this is what a flowchart looks like. So basically, it's a representation of everything that can happen in the application. So on the left side, we have in yellow the possible actions that the user can take. And then from there, we see what happens in the application as one of these options is basically chosen. So as one of the actions is executed. So whenever the user rolls the dice, so clicks that roll dice button, then we need to generate a random dice roll. Then we display that dice roll, and then we check whether it is a 1. If it's not a 1, then add that dice roll to the current score. Okay. And of course, display it. Right? So that is exactly the behavior that we saw when we tested out the game earlier. Right?
Cái này
Now, if the
nhân
dice roll
phẩm
is
là
actually
nhân
a
phẩm.
1, then simply switch the player. And so in this case, the dice roll will not get added to the current score.
Mà sao online được
The
ta?
other option is that the user wants to hold his score, and then we add the current score to the total score. Once that is done, we must check if the score is above or equal 100.
Game này chơi 2 người rồi nè em. Nhưng mà mới giới thiệu thôi, chưa có làm được.
Because as I said,
Không, em này chắc ngày mai mới làm được.
Player wins whenever the score
Game này
is
nó khó, cái
at
này nó
least
khó
100
lập trình
points.
hơn cái kia, nó là tổng hợp hết
And
luôn.
if it's not, then we just switch the player, and the game keeps on running. Finally, when the user chooses to reset the game, we simply set all scores to 0 and set the player number 1 back to being the starting player. All right, so this is a very nice way, again, to visualize what happens in the application, and it's also a very good guide for us to actually implement the application in code. So usually, whenever I build a project like this one, I like to draw a flowchart like this. And it doesn't need to have all this precision right from the start, so we can just start out with a rough sketch without the complete plan of what we're going to build. But anyway, this is very helpful before we actually start writing code to have a good idea of what we will have to do. And if you want to build your own flowcharts that look like this, you can do so on diagrams.net. So that's where I designed this flow.
Diagram. Net. Vẽ flowchart. Okay.
And it's a very nice online drawing application that is completely free and really easy and fast to use. Okay, and so now, as always, let's open up our project folder. So I have the starter files here already, and now I need a new VS Code window. And then I just open the pick game. And this time, since the application needs this whole space, let's actually put it here on the separate desktop. And then as we test out, I will just move here from one desktop to the other. So let's make this bigger this time. And so, like always, we already have all our files here. So let's take a look at them. And JavaScript. So here, as always, just the use strict. Then here we have all the styles that we need for the application, and we will take a look at them as we go through the project. And then finally, the HTML file. Okay, and I also actually included the image of this flowchart here for you, so that you can maybe take a look at it yourself to make sure that you really understand how it works. Okay, so take a minute or two to maybe test the app again and check out this flowchart before we actually start. All right. Oh, also, I wanted to show you that I have one image here for each of the dices. So dice 1 looks like this, like 2 looks like this, and so on and so forth. So we have one image for each of the possible 6 numbers. So that's going to be important later. But now let's just start to write a little bit of code here. Let's get ourselves a new terminal here so that we can take a look at the application as it looks right now. And here I like to minimize it a little bit. Live server. Okay. And so this is our live version of the pick game. So again, we are here at this localhost at port 8080. And if you're seeing some other port, that's no problem at all, as long as it works. So maybe you still have something running on this port, maybe from the previous project, and then this project will run on another port. That doesn't really matter. So right now, in the starting point, this is what our application looks like. But of course, in the demo, we don't see the dice in the beginning, and we don't see any scores here. Okay? And so the first thing that we're going to do is to basically put these scores to 0 and make this dice disappear. And so that's going to be basically the starting condition here. So let's go back here to the code, and let me just show you where these initial values come from. So this is the 43 score that we just saw, and this is the 24.
ID.
And so let's take a moment to inspect the code, because as you already know, we need the class names, and in this case also the IDs, to then identify and select the elements. So basically, here we have one of these sections here for each of the players. And you see that the first one is player 0, and the second one is player 1. And I will explain you why the players are called 0 and 1 instead of 1 and 2, probably in the next lecture. So it will make sense by then, okay? But now about the scores, they are stored in this element and in this one here. And so you see both of them have the score class, but then each of them has a different ID. And so this time we need to select these two elements using their unique ID instead of a class name. So that's the ID of score dash dash 0 and score dash dash 1. So let's do that. So const score 1 and then document dot query selector. So this is the way that we learned it before. And now here we actually need the hash symbol.
Ủa, ở đây
So
mà.
score 0. So actually I'm interested in 0 here. Okay, and so again, now we used this hash because that is the selector for the ID. And the dot that we used to use is only for classes. Okay, now when we're selecting using an ID, then there's actually another way of selecting an element. And right now that's exactly what we're doing. So we're interested in IDs, not in classes. And so let me show you that other way of selecting elements that only works by ID. So let's call this one score 1. And then again, we use document, but then we're not calling query selector. Instead, we call get element by ID. And then here we just pass in the name of the ID. So just score 1. So without the hash here, because now we're not writing a selector, we are only passing in the name of the ID that we're looking for. Okay, so this works exactly the same as this, but the get element by ID is supposed to be a little bit faster than query selector. But I guess that's only relevant if you're selecting like thousands of elements at once. So usually I like to always use query selector, but I still wanted to show you that there also exists get element by ID. All right. And actually let's call these two here score 0 L, which stands for element, because you might then confuse maybe this variable here for simply the score value of player 0, right? And so in this case, we are making it really clear that this is a DOM element. So score 0 L. All right. Okay. So we're selecting these here, and now we can use the variables to do something on them. And again, we do that because probably we will need to do something with these selected elements multiple times throughout the application. And so we just define them once at the top of our file instead of having to select the same elements over and over again. So let's just add a comment here. And comments are also a good way of structuring the code and also of planning how we will build some features. So selecting elements. And so in this project, we will try to get a little bit more used to actually writing
Này rồi sao cái này nó đéo đổi ta?
comments. All right. Anyway, let's now set these initial conditions of score 0 element. And then, as you know, we use text content, and then we set it to 0. All right. And now the same for score 1. Score 1 element dot text content to 0. And here we are specifying numbers, not strings, but JavaScript will then automatically convert them to strings to actually display them on the page. So if we go now to the application, that should already be in effect. And indeed, you see that now the scores are actually at 0. Great. Now all we have to do is to hide this dice here. And so let's do that using the technique that we learned in the previous project, which is basically creating a hidden class and then add that hidden class here at the beginning. Okay. So let's go to our style. And right now I don't have that class yet. So let's just create it. And I can close the terminal here. Let's just do that at the very end. So we create a class like this, and then we just set the display to none. So that's exactly the class that we had in the previous project as well. Okay, and so now we can just add that class to the dice at the beginning of the game. So that's easy enough, but first we need to select it. So let's call it dice L for the dice element. Let's check out what the ID or the class of it is. And here we see that it's actually just this dice class. So this image with this class of dice. So document dot query selector dice. And so here we have the starting conditions. And now let's simply do dice element dot class list dot add, and now simply the string which contains the name of the class. And that's the hidden class. Give it a save. Let's check it out. And indeed, now the dice is gone. And let's see the HTML here actually. And now indeed, we have the hidden class here besides the dice class. Great. And then as we implement the roll dice functionality, of course, we will want the dice to be visible. And then we can simply remove that class again from the dice. Okay. And actually, that's exactly what we're going to do in the next video.
Nếu hơi trễ có lẽ để này bữa sau học tiếp. Để sáng mai có thể sáng mai mình có hứng thú mình học. Thật sự rất hứng thú luôn mà trễ rồi. Biết giờ nãy học sớm hơn. Ok, cảm ơn mọi người. Hôm nay học tới đây thôi.